Hi, I'm Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. In this week's Print Eye on China column, I explored the Chinese discourse on the recent thaw in India China relations. Um, this thaw happened after nearly 5 years of border tensions, after 5 years of negotiation between India China military establishment as well as Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, this significant shift is marked by a new patrolling agreement at the line of actual control. That is definitely a good development, but it does raise a few critical questions. And the questions are about the longevity of India China rapprochement and how China is viewing this particular development and India's approach towards China. And when I talk about the Chinese discourse, I primarily am talking about the Chinese media, online platforms, as well as the strategic community. So this is, I think there is definitely a change in how China is viewing India, because what I'm seeing is this is the very first time in the recent past that how India is becoming a hotly debated topic within the Chinese online discourse. So this agreement was very important as this facilitated the first in-person meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well as Chinese President Xi Jinping, and they met for the first time in 5 years on the sidelines of the 16th BRICS summit. While Indian media and much of the strategic community analysts are viewing this development with a very cautious approach. They are optimistic about it, but they have adopted a cautiously optimistic stance towards this rapprochement, this thaw between India and China, and rightly so. But if we look at the discourse that is coming emerging out of China, uh, there is an indication of a contrasting sentiment. Many Chinese commentators interpreting India's decision to announce the patrolling agreement first as a positive step toward normalizing the relations. And there is definitely a wave of optimism in China that differs from the cautious approach, the perspective that we have taken in India. And also, given the past and how China has violated the agreements with India and how the pattern has been, I think this is a very important perspective that we are in India, the media and the strategic community is kind of showing. So now the next question is, what has driven this latest round of rapprochement, this thaw? Various Chinese commentators and analysts are suggesting that the timing is intentional and very strategic, particular in the context as it coincided with the Kazan BRICS summit. The timing may also indicate, this is the Chinese perspective, may indicate Prime Minister Modi's intent to foster deeper collaboration with China. Then, apart from that, economic compulsion factors definitely have played an important role here. As China is India's top trading partner, this economic interdependence, or I would rather call it economic dependence, according to the Chinese discourse, is influencing India's relatively conciliatory and friendly approach towards China. And this is very important when we weigh the benefits of normalized, stable relationship with respect to China against the geopolitical tensions that we have been seeing in the recent past. But of course, I think this is something that we have seen in the Indian discourse as well, that how investment, the prospects of investment is something that India has taken into consideration with respect to easing tensions with China. But apart from that, one of the major factors that have been emerged out of the Chinese discourse is also how India's relationship with the West is being viewed, particularly in the light of the recent tensions with the latest round of tension with Canada. So it's very interesting that some of the Chinese analysts are at kind of attributing this thaw between India and China to India's rising tensions with Canada, as well as a growing perception of Western partners as being unreliable to India. And Chinese analysts are actually arguing that India is now reassessing its partnership, its like minded partnership, particularly with the United States, as well as other Western countries. But they are also of the belief that under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership, specifically since the beginning of his third term in May, India has adopted a more pragmatic strategy, more pragmatic approach towards China, which has diverged from previous Western alignments of India. And perhaps there is this perception that Modi 3.0 is soft on China. So this is also one of the prevalent views on the Chinese internet now. Um, then of course this has been one of the factors that how, because of investment, because of the unreliability of the western partners, India has kind of become a little accommodative towards China. However, the durability of this temporary peace of this rapprochement will hinge on reciprocal actions from China. And this was a recent statement from India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. And this is the statement that has garnered a lot of attention from the Chinese strategic community. Scholars from China, they argue that India is now attributing the blame of differences with China only on China. And this is something that perhaps India has to get away from. And this discussion, the statement from the External Affairs Minister is somewhat misguided. And this might also hinder the progress in the relationship. And many of the scholars that have been prominent scholars on India, they have been urging India to improve relations with China that would require effort and sincerity primarily from the Indian side. So definitely there is divergence of narrative, the divergence of discourse that we are seeing in India and from that we are seeing in China. Then some commentators also view this recent agreement as primarily a technical measure to stabilize the tension that we have been seeing in the past 4 or 5 years. And they are actually saying that this is not a concessionary approach from the Chinese side, and that China has not really given any concession to India with respect to its sovereignty. So I think this is one of the narrative that China has been trying to establish, that India has become soft, and this was primarily coming from the Indian side, and China has not really compromised on any of the aspects of the territorial dispute. And the recent confrontations have highlighted Chinese military capabilities in its infrastructure development, that perhaps lead India to recognize China's control over its actions. That perhaps this idea that China is much more superior than India, and this is something that has led India to reach out to China. That there is no match between China and India. This is also one of the perspectives that we have been hearing from the Chinese side. Then in Chinese discourse, this particular development is being framed as a victory for China, as a diplomatic victory for China, with some voices also suggesting that India has finally awoken to the realities of its relationship with China as well as with the US, and that US is, as usual, unreliable partner, and then India is realizing that it's very important to reassess and perhaps normalize its relation with China. Then the Chinese narrative positions India as a lesser or a weaker power in this dynamic, in this India China dynamic and this India China thaw. In fact, there are a number of posts and a number of videos on Chinese microblogging website Weibo that suggested that the disengagement mainly involves Indian troops withdrawing from the border areas, and it's not Chinese troops that are withdrawing from the border areas. And this is one disinformation that we have seen, specifically with respect to the latest round of development. So, despite India's ongoing efforts to resolve dispute through military and diplomatic channels, this is something that we have seen, that India has been consistent with this policy with respect to China. No matter what the differences were, India has always kept the negotiating channels open with China. So the situation appears to benefit China, particularly due to the alignment with Russia and the partial isolation from the West. And in fact, if we look at the optics that came out from the BRICS summit that just concluded last week, it depicted that India is a neutral country, is not really being a part of anti-China coalition that is led by the US, or if it's not neutral, at least it is kind of not leaning towards the anti-China coalition. And in fact, one of the narratives that was being established, that India is now leaning towards anti-Western coalition. And in fact, if we look at it, BRICS summit was also kind of portrayed as an anti-West coalition, as an anti-West grouping, specifically from the Chinese and the Russian side. So the BRICS summit, the latest round of rapprochement thaw between India and China, it kind of reinforced the Chinese narrative, and specifically when Modi the photo that was circulated after the BRICS summit, where Prime Minister Modi, was standing in between Chinese President Xi and Russian President Putin. So I think this is something that was a successful establishment of a narrative with respect to the BRICS summit as well as India-China relationship. But then we also have to keep in mind that much of the Chinese commentary frames this thaw within the context of the broader US-China rivalry. And what I've also realized that much of the discourse is neglecting India's actual interest and its approach towards China. In my opinion, India still remains committed to strategic autonomy. It has till now avoided overt coalition against any third country, and it also, and when in 2018 India came up with its Indo-Pacific strategy, from then till now, India has viewed China as an important component within its broader Indo-Pacific strategy. So I do not really see any change in India's Indo-Pacific strategy, in India's change um, in its China policy. So I think it has remained the same. India's policy has definitely been consistent with respect to the US, with respect to its partnership with the West, Indo Pacific, as well as China. So, in my opinion, while the recent agreement is a positive move towards reducing tensions with China, and it was absolutely important to resolve lingering differences with China. China is just next door. China is the largest economy and the second most populous nation in the world. So there is economic interdependence. So it was definitely important to resolve the differences. But I do believe that lasting peace requires China to address structural issues that have been existing for decades and still exist. This particular development doesn't mean that the relationship has gone back to normal, has gone back to pre-Galwan status quo. I do not really think so, and I think this is also a consensus that we have been seeing, at least in Indian media as well as strategic community. So this temporary truce is actually fragile, in my opinion, and could easily falter unless both India and China effectively manage their differences. But what is more important here is that India is definitely not abandoning whatever it has worked for with respect to the West. It's not abandoning its like minded partnership, which goes beyond the US China dynamics, which goes beyond China, which also goes beyond the US. So, India's approach, which is marked by multi alignment, strategic autonomy, issue based coalition, this is something that has been shaping India's policy towards China as well as towards the US. And this is something that China has been kind of neglecting, has been kind of undermining. So India's cautious approach is still very much there. India is not blindly trusting the Chinese side. The issues remain the same. The issue remain intact, and India's caution is also very important. Is vital given the past patterns of signing confidence building measures, then China's violation of the agreements, and then the repeated incursion that we have been seeing for decades. So, in this context, it is very important, it is crucial for China to recognize India's shifting perception regarding the line of actual control. This is something that China has also been undermining. Even today, it's not going to be about the broader aspects of the relationship. The border dispute, the standoff, will definitely determine the future of the relationship. And this is something that China has to keep in mind while strengthening ties, if at all it wants to strengthen ties with India. So, to conclude, I would say that any further incursion could trigger a stronger and a firmer response from New Delhi, and that would threaten the fragile peace that we are seeing right now. While India has adopted a cautious approach and it has accepted Beijing's olive branch for now, the onus for maintaining stability in the relationship absolutely lies on China. Thank you, and I will see you.